2014 from the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations addressed to the President of the Security Council. S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance,
я также приветствую на сегодняшнем заседании Генерального секретаря Организации Объединенных Наций Антонио Гутерреш. Заседание также примет участие на основании 39-й временных правил процедуры Совета заместитель генерального секретаря по политическим вопросам и вопросам миростроительства госпожа Розмари Декаро. Сейчас Совет Безопасности приступит к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. Я хотел бы приветствовать его превосходительство генерального секретаря Антонио Гутерреша и предоставить ему слово.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, I want to reaffirm what I expressed this morning in the meeting of the General Assembly. But of course, it wouldn't make any sense to bother you reading again the same text that I'm sure you are all aware of. In between, during the day, a number of events took place, and with your permission, Mr. President, I would like to ask Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo to be able to brief you on those events. But simultaneously, the day was full of rumors and indications that an offensive against the Ukraine was imminent. In the recent past, there were several situations with similar indications, similar rumors. And I never believed in them, convinced that nothing serious would happen. I was wrong. And I would like not to be wrong again today. So, if indeed an operation is being prepared, I have only one thing to say from the bottom of my heart. President Putin, stop your troops from attacking the Ukraine. Give peace a chance. Too many people have already died. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Secretary General for his introductory remarks. And I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier today, the so-called authorities of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics requested military assistance from the Russian Federation. Also today, the Ukrainian authorities declared a nationwide state of emergency and announced other related defense and security measures, including the mobilization of reservists. Throughout the day, we've seen disturbing reports of continued heavy shelling across the contact line and civilian and military casualties. There are also reports of the repeated targeting of civilian infrastructure. This evening, different media are carrying reports of an ongoing large-scale military buildup and on military columns moving towards Ukraine. The Russian Federation has also reportedly shut airspace to civilian aircraft near the border with Ukraine. The United Nations cannot verify any of these reports, but if these developments were confirmed, they would greatly aggravate an already dangerous situation. The Ukrainian authorities are also reporting a new large-scale cyber attack targeting several state and financial institutions. Mr. President, President Zelensky earlier this evening called for continued diplomacy. Separately, President Putin also spoke about his continued readiness to engage in dialogue. We encourage such efforts, even at this late hour. UN staff remain on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. We are committed to staying and delivering. All parties must ensure their safety and security. Respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law is also paramount. We cannot predict exactly what will happen in the coming hours and days in Ukraine. What is clear is the unacceptably high cost in human suffering and destruction of an escalation. The people of Ukraine want peace, and I'm certain the people of Russia want peace. We must do everything in our power to ensure that peace prevails. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю госпожу Ди Карло за
I
ее
thank
брифинг.
Mr. Carlo
И
for
сейчас
her briefing, and I
предоставляю
now give the
слово
floor to
тем членам
those
Совета,
council members who
которые
wish to
хотели бы
make
высказать заявление.
statements.
И первым
I give
предоставляю
the
слово
floor
представителю Албании.
first to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, this is the fourth time the Council is meeting in Ukraine in a matter of weeks. Every time we meet, reality on the ground confirms, bit by bit, what some of us have been anticipating. Russia has been saying one thing and doing its contrary. We were told troops were retreating when they only have increased. We were told to stop hysteria since troops were in Russian territory. No longer. They are invading a neighbor unprovoked with false pretexts, false narratives, and fabricated news. Every development unfolding in the last 48 hours confirms, to us and to the world, that Russian worries have nothing to do with its security, that its anxieties are not linked to NATO enlargement, that this issue is not a confrontation between Russia and the West. This is a confrontation between Russia and international law, the UN Charter that it deliberately has chosen to ignore, a confrontation between a hegemonistic vision and the rules-based world order. Dear colleagues, it's not about Russia's concern, it's about Russia's appetite. The Ukrainians are facing another aggression just because they dare to exist, because they have chosen to be independent, because they have opted for democracy. Dear colleagues, this is a dark hour not only for Ukraine, but for the entire international community as we witness with trepidation the progression of a pure act of aggression carefully planned and cold-bloodedly being executed. We called and hoped for a back down of the Russian Federation from this senseless, destructive and self-destructive action. We repeat the same call for Russia to stop, to reflect, to reverse its illegal decisions, to withdraw from this senseless madness, to de-escalate, not to push towards precipice. Several mechanisms are in place and various proposals have been made, including by President Zelensky, whose calls remain unanswered. Diplomacy is like hope. It dies last. But for it to work, it must be seized, not ignored, as the Secretary General just called for here. We call on the fellow members of the Security Council to rally in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia has been warned repeatedly that they will be alone in this foolishness, that they will be responsible for the innocent lives lost, including Russians maybe, and for the destruction caused in the heart of Europe in the 21st century. If they choose to continue to execute their plans, as everything indicates, they will bear not only the consequences of the war, but also the historical blame and shame of invading a neighboring country when its responsibility as a big country, as a permanent member of the Security Council, calls for it to work and help preserve peace and security, not to torpedo it. We reiterate our support to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and territorial waters. In concluding, I welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. I would like to convey to him, to the Ukrainian government and people, that at this most critical moment in their history, they are not alone, and we stand firm in full solidarity with them for their rights to be free and choose who they want to be. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Албании за его заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Соединенных Штатов.
To the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Secretary General. Thank you for your strong stance and your powerful remarks today at the General Assembly and for your remarks tonight. Colleagues, a few moments ago, I spoke to President Biden, who asked me to convey in the strongest possible terms his and our steadfast support for Ukraine and support for the urgent meeting this Council has convened tonight. Furthermore, he asked me to share that the United States and our allies and partners will continue to respond to Russia's actions with unity, with clarity, and with conviction. We are here tonight because we believe, along with Ukraine, that a full-scale further invasion into Ukraine by Russia is imminent. Tonight, we're seeing the Russians close airspace, move troops into Donbass, and move forces into combat-ready positions. This is a perilous moment, and we're here for one reason and one reason only: to ask Russia to stop, return to your borders, send your troops and your tanks and your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and send your diplomats to the negotiating table. Back away from the brink before it is too late. Last week, the United States informed this Council and the world about what we expected to see unfold. We said that Russia would manufacture a pretext for an attack. We have since seen numerous false flag events staged along the lines of contact in Donbass. We said Russia would theatrically convene emergency meetings at the highest levels of the Russian government. We all saw this on Monday with the state televised Security Council meeting held by President Putin, an orchestrated moment in which the Russian government decided to recognize as, and I quote, independent states, unquote, sovereign territory of Ukraine controlled by Russia's proxies since 2014. They literally violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity on live television before the world. We said that false proclamations would come declaring Russia would need to defend Russian speakers in Ukraine. We got that and much more from President Putin's speech on Monday and during the speech of the Russian ambassador in the General Assembly today. No one could have predicted just how dangerous, inciting, and far-reaching President Putin's speech would be, with Putin arguing for taking the world back in time to an era of empires and colonies. Finally, we said the attack would come next, that we could expect communications to be jammed, cyber attacks to shut down key Ukrainian institutions. Last week, we attributed to Russia denial of service attacks against Ukrainian banks, and we saw similar activity this morning targeting government sites as well. And in the last few hours, we have received very concerning reports of destructive malware placed on hundreds of computers and executed on at least some. After that, we said would come the bombs and missiles, the soldiers and the tanks. Already soldiers have been deployed to the occupied region of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight because we believe the rest is imminent. Now, over the past few weeks, Russia has called our predictions hysterical. Russia said we were lying. Russia said we were supplying the world with misinformation. Russia's diplomats even laughed in the face of the human suffering we were sounding the alarm about. But what we said would happen has come to pass for all the world to see. So let us be clear. All parties are not culpable here. There's no middle ground. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. Russia's attack on Ukraine is tantamount to an attack on the UN and every member state in the chamber tonight. The Security Council is charged with adjudicating threats to peace and security. Russia is bypassing it entirely and taking matters into its own hands. And that undermines the institution. It undermines everyone who participates in it. The United States, Ukraine, its allies and partners across Europe, UN officials, every other member of this Security Council, we have all repeatedly implored Russia to engage at the diplomatic table. Those calls were not heard. Instead, tonight, Russia has brought its people, the Ukrainian people, and the world to the brink of a conflict that will produce an untold amount of human suffering. I said it in the General Assembly this morning, and I'll say it again tonight. Everyday Russians should be asking themselves right now how many Russian lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. Responsible members of this Security Council will stand together, and we will stand with Ukraine. And we will do so despite a reckless, irresponsible, permanent member of the Security Council abusing its powers to attack its neighbor and subvert the UN and our international system. This morning in the General Assembly, we saw dozens of leaders from across the globe stand up to defend the UN Charter and Ukraine against Russia's brazen attacks. We were proud to stand with them. Today, I had the opportunity to meet with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba. And many of you were in the General Assembly Hall this morning when Foreign Minister Kuleba received enthusiastic and overwhelming applause after his remarks. Since he could not be here this evening, I would like to conclude by echoing his words. This morning, he warned us all that, quote, no one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides that he can move forward with this aggression against Ukraine. Your governments and your people will face painful consequences together with our government and our people, unquote. He is right. History tells us that. And we must confront this threat head on in this council, in the UN, and in our capitals. The people of Ukraine are counting on us. Let's not let them down. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю
I
представителя
thank the
Соединенных
representative of the
Штатов
United
за ее
States
заявление.
for her
Сейчас
statement, and I now
представляю слово
give the floor
представителю
to the
Соединенного Королевства.
representative of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, I thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General Di Carlo for their remarks. We are here tonight to call on Russia to avert war. For months, Russia has been holding a gun to Ukraine's head. Now, President Putin's finger is on the trigger. A full-scale conflict in a country of 44 million people will bring immense suffering, casualties on both sides, and devastating humanitarian consequences. The members of this Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary-General have all called this week for respect for the principles of the UN Charter. The world is calling for peace, but Russia is not listening. Mr. President, make no mistake, the UK will not compromise. We will not compromise our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, our support for peace, prosperity, and the democratic freedom of the people of Ukraine. We will not compromise our commitment to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. Above all, the founding principle of this United Nations, that we live together in peace with one another as good neighbours. Russia's actions are an assault on the Charter. And we will not compromise our commitment to a search for peace. We're here for the second time this week in the Council. My Prime Minister and Foreign and Defence Secretaries have been unsparing in their diplomatic efforts. But we have also announced a significant further sanction step against Russia with our allies, a package targeted against some of the Russian oligarchs, banks, and politicians supporting President Putin. And we will ratchet up economic consequences should Russia continue its aggression. There is still time for restraint, reason, and de-escalation. But that time is now. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя Соединенного Королевства за ее
The
заявление.
representative
Сейчас
of the United
предоставляю слово
Kingdom for
представителю
her
Франции.
statement, and I now give the floor to representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
President,
je remercie le secrétaire général pour sa
Secretary
mobilisation et pour son
for his
appel
engagement
que la France
and for his
soutient
call,
pleinement.
which France
À l'heure où
fully
nous parlons,
supports.
la
As we
Russie
speak,
est sur le point
Russia
de
is on
provoquer
the
le
verge
chaos en
of
Ukraine
provoking
et de
chaos in
porter un
Ukraine
coup injustifiable
and
à la paix
striking
et à la
an
sécurité
unjustifiable
au cœur de
blow
l'Europe.
to peace and
Depuis
security
plusieurs
in the
mois,
heart of Europe.
le président de la Fédération de
For several
Russie
months, the
a
president of the
patiemment
Russian
préparé
Federation
de quoi
has
mener
patiently
une offensive
prepared
majeure
the
contre
means
l'Ukraine.
for a major offensive
Il a amassé
against
des soldats et
Ukraine.
des armes
He has
à un
massed
niveau sans précédent
soldiers and gathered
depuis la
weapons
fin de la
at
Seconde
an
Guerre mondiale
unprecedented level since
Il a
the
incité
end
à la
of the Second
violence
World War.
par le
He has
mensonge et la
incited
désinformation.
violence through
Il a
lies
nié
and
jusqu'à la
disinformation.
légitimité
He has
même de
denied
l'État
even the
ukrainien.
legitimacy of the
Il a
Ukrainian
porté atteinte
state
à la souveraineté
He has
et à
attacked
l'intégrité
sovereignty
de l'Ukraine
and
par la
the
reconnaissance de
integrity
l'indépendance
of
de
Ukraine
portions
by
du territoire
recognizing the
ukrainien.
independence of portions of Ukrainian
Face à cette
territory.
stratégie de
Faced
menace
with this
et de
strategy of
déstabilisation,
threats and
l'Ukraine a fait
destabilization,
preuve d'une retenue admirable.
Ukraine has
Elle n'a pas
demonstrated
cédé à la
admirable
violence
restraint.
en dépit
It
des
did not
incitations
resort to
russes.
violence despite
Je veux redire
Russian
notre
provocation.
solidarité avec le
I
peuple
wish to
ukrainien,
reiterate our
comme l'a rappelé le
solidarity
président
with the people
Macron
of Ukraine,
à son homologue ukrainien
as
il y a quelques
President
heures.
Macron reminded his
Face à cette
Ukrainian
stratégie de
counterpart
désordre
a
et
few
de
hours ago.
confrontation, les
Faced
dirigeants
with this
d'Europe et
strategy
des
of
États-Unis
disorder
ont
and
démontré leur
confrontation,
unité
the leaders of
et
Europe and the
redoublé
United
d'efforts
States
pour
showed
proposer
their unity
une issue
and redoubled their
diplomatique.
efforts
Le
to
président Macron,
propose
en lien avec le
a
chancelier
diplomatic
Scholz
outcome.
et de nombreux
President
partenaires,
Macron,
y ont pris toute leur
together
part.
with Chancellor
Ils ont
Scholz
fait part
and
de leur
many partners,
disponibilité
have
à
all
construire
done their part.
avec la Russie
They have
une architecture de
demonstrated
sécurité
their
renouvelée
availability
pour l'Europe.
to build with Russia
La
a
France
renewed
condamne avec
security
force
architecture for
la
Europe.
stratégie de provocation à la guerre du président
France
russe,
strongly condemns the
Nous
strategy
entendons
of
l'appel du
provocation
peuple
to
ukrainien,
war of the Russian
porté
president.
par le président
We hear the
Zelensky dans son
call
adresse à la
of
nation
the
il y a
Ukrainian
quelques
people,
heures.
conveyed by President
Les
Zelensky
Ukrainiens
in his
veulent
address
la
to
paix.
the Russian nation
Ils
a
souhaitent une
few
relation
hours
de bon
ago.
voisinage avec la
Ukrainians
Russie,
want peace.
à
They want
l'image
a relationship
des
of
relations
good
familiales et
neighborliness
personnelles
with
qui
Russia.
unissent tant de Russes et d'Ukrainiens.
mirroring the family and
Monsieur le
personal
Président,
relationships which
la communauté
bind
internationale
to so
a
many
de manière unie
Russians
fait
and
entendre sa
Ukrainians.
voix
The
aujourd'hui à
international
l'Assemblée
community,
générale.
Mr.
C'est
President,
celle du respect
has
de la Charte des
made
Nations
its
Unies,
voice heard,
celle du
its
règlement
united voice
pacifique des
today at
conflits,
the General Assembly.
celle de la diplomatie.
It
Elle
is
fait
that of
écho
respect of the
aux
Charter of the
déclarations
United
claires
Nations,
du
the
secrétaire
peaceful
général.
settlement of disputes,
Nous appelons
that of
une nouvelle fois
diplomacy. It
la
echoes the
Fédération de
clear
Russie
declarations of
à
the
suivre
Secretary
cette
General.
voie, à
Once again,
revenir sur sa
we
décision de
call on the
reconnaissance
Russian
des
Federation to
entités
follow this
séparatistes
path,
de l'Est de l'Ukraine
to
et à
draw
rappeler ses
back
soldats.
on its decision
Nous
to
appelons chacun
recognize
des membres de
separatist
ce
entities
Conseil
of Eastern Ukraine
à
and to
agir en
call its
responsabilité
soldiers back.
et à
We call
soutenir
each of the
de manière
members of this
résolue
council to
toutes
act
les
responsibly
initiatives
and to
visant à
resolutely
prévenir
support
et à mettre un
all
terme aux
initiatives
violations de
to
la Charte
prevent
des
and
Nations
put an
Unies.
end to violations
Si la
of the
Russie
Charter of the United
confirme le choix de la
Nations.
guerre,
If Russia
elle devra en
confirms that
assumer
its
toutes
choice
les
is war,
responsabilités et en
it will
payer
have
le
to
prix.
take all of the responsibility and pay the price. Thank you.
Я благодарю
I
представителя
thank the
Франции за его
representative
заявление.
of France for his
Предоставляю слово
statement. I now
представителю
give the
Ирландии.
floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General De Carlo for their very sobering remarks at the beginning of our meeting. Mr. President, tonight as we gather at this table, we are staring into the abyss of a major conflict in Europe, a conflict that would have major global implications. Tonight, the core principles of this United Nations, in which we believe, are under attack. In Ireland, we know the importance of the rules-based international order. We know the importance of respecting the voice and integrity of all countries, big or small. Most fundamentally, we know the value of peace. We believe that one state threatening and using lethal force against another to get its way or to expand its territory is no solution. Ireland has a deep understanding, informed by our history, that dialogue and respect resolve disputes. Tonight, this drives our solidarity with Ukraine. It is our collective responsibility, indeed our obligation here at this table, to maintain international peace and security, nothing less. That means we stand up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every member state of the United Nations. Let's be clear, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine have not changed. The decision by Russia to recognize as independent entities the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine does not change those borders one iota. They did not change in 2014, and they have not changed this week. We urge the Russian Federation to reverse this decision immediately. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from further escalatory unilateral actions which can only serve to further deepen this crisis. Tonight, the path for diplomacy, the path for dialogue that we have called on for so long is perilously narrow. The principles of the UN Charter we hold dear have already been breached. These principles now risk being further violated. This is the time to show courage, the courage and the time now to pull back from the precipice, the time to return to dialogue and to diplomacy. The use of military aggression has no place in our modern world. Have we learned absolutely nothing from our history? These United Nations rose from the ashes of 2 world wars. The senseless destruction of that era was born of a belief that military might makes right. This philosophy, applied with modern weaponry, would unleash devastation and human suffering, affecting millions of innocent people. Tonight, we stand with the people of Ukraine. tonight we stand with the UN Charter. We stand with those who, even in this dark hour, still have the courage and hope to bring us back from this precipice. A resort to military conquest for one state to impose its will unilaterally against another, to annex part of its territory, has absolutely no place in the 21st century. There is still a choice to turn from the path of war to the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, it is never too late to make the right choice. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Secretary General for his briefing on the evolving situation in the eastern regions of Ukraine. The Security Council had met 2 days ago and discussed the situation. We had called for urgent de-escalation of tensions and emphasized on sustained and focused diplomacy to address all issues concerning the situation. However, we note with regret that the calls of the international community to give time to the recent initiatives undertaken by parties to diffuse tensions were not heeded to. The situation is in danger of spiraling into a major crisis. We express our deep concern over the developments which, if not handled carefully, may well undermine the peace and security of the region. We call for immediate de-escalation and for refraining from any further action that could contribute to a worsening of the situation. We call on all parties to exert greater efforts to bridge divergent interests. I would like to underline that the legitimate security interests of all parties should be fully taken into account. India has consistently advocated at the United Nations the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and with agreements entered into by parties concerned. I underline once again that more than 20,000 Indian nationals, including students, are located in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. We are facilitating the return of all Indian nationals, including students, as may be required. We believe that the solution lies in sustained diplomatic dialogue between the concerned parties. In the meantime, we strongly emphasize the vital need for all sides to maintain international peace and security by exercising the utmost restraint. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس، أود بداية أن أشكر الأمين العام ووكيلة الأمين العام على مداخلاتهما. اجتماعنا هذا هو الاجتماع الرابع الذي يعقده مجلس الأمن حول أوكرانيا في أقل من شهر، وفي ظل التوترات الأخيرة والمثيرة للقلق أخذت بلادي موقفا يتمثل في الدعوة إلى خفض التصعيد والعمل على إيجاد حل سلمي للأزمة. وفي هذا الإطار نود أن نشير للجوانب التالية. أولا، نؤكد على ضرورة اللجوء للحوار وبحسن نية مع تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية على كافة الأصعدة لدعم فرص السلام بالارتكاز للقانون الدولي. ونكرر أن اتفاقات مينسك لا تزال تشكل أساسا جيدا للوصول إلى حل سلمي للأزمة، وبما يحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين والدوليين. ثانيا، نشدد على ضرورة الالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، لا سيما من حيث تسوية المنازعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية واحترام سيادة واستقلال الدول ووحدة أراضيها وسلامتها الإقليمية. إن الالتزام بهذه المبادئ والامتثال لميثاق الأمم المتحدة يعد ركيزة أساسية للتوصل لأي حل مستدام وسلمي للأزمة القائمة. ثالثا، نكرر بأن الوضع المتأزم في شرق أوكرانيا قد يفاقم من الوضع الحرج للمدنيين، ناهيكم عن استمرار وجود تحديات تتعلق بإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية لبعض المحتاجين، لا سيما في المناطق القريبة من خط النزاع في شرق أوكرانيا، وذلك قبل حدوث التوترات الحالية. إن أي تصعيد آخر قد يؤدي لتفاقم الوضع الإنساني لعدد أكبر من المدنيين، وعليه نكرر أهمية العمل على خفض التصعيد ووقف إطلاق النار، ونهيب في هذا الشأن بجميع الأطراف بأهمية عدم التعرض للمساعدات الإنسانية والمدنيين في مناطق النزاع بما يتماشى مع التزاماتهما بموجب القانون الدولي. وختاما السيد الرئيس، تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية وقف التصعيد واللجوء للحوار البناء ومواصلة العمل لإيجاد حلول سلمية تتسق مع القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة.
Я благодарю
I thank the
представителя
representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the
представителю
floor
Норвегии.
to the representative of Norway.
President, I thank the Secretary General and USG Rosemary DiCarlo for their important statement. We are facing the dire prospect of a major war in Europe. Norway strongly condemns the decision by President Putin to send Russian troops into Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the latest announcements of special military operation. These decisions are unjustified, unprovoked, and irresponsible. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions and to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and in the vicinity of its internationally recognized borders. Our thoughts are with those who have already suffered too much due to this conflict, and with all those who are afraid that tomorrow will be a lot worse. We call upon all parties to strictly respect the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law, which calls on the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and civilian infrastructure, and to facilitate safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in Ukraine. Like the Secretary General clearly stated, the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independent of Donetsk and Luhansk regions are violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Let me recall the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, which are now under threat. The Charter applies to all nations, including Russia. Today in the General Assembly, member states from all over the world strongly urge the parties to pursue negotiation towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, with respect for international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Norway urges Russia, as a party to the Minsk Agreement and to the conflict, to fulfill its commitments, to abide by international law, and to return to the path of diplomacy. Russia has taken on a clear commitment to seek a peaceful settlement to this conflict and must honor it. We commend Ukraine's posture of restraint in the face of continued provocation and destabilization efforts. President, let me conclude by again reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
乌克兰局势
the
正
situation
处
in
于
Ukraine
关键时
is
刻，
at a critical juncture.
中方对此
China has
高度
been
关注。
paying close attention to the
当前
situation.
形势下
In，the current context,
有关各
all
方
parties
都要
concerned
保持克
should
制，
exercise restraint
避免紧
and
张局
avoid
势
the
进一步
further
升级。
escalation of tensions.
我们相信
We believe that
和平解
the
决
door
乌
to a
克兰
peaceful
问题的大
solution
门
to the Ukraine
没有完
issue
全
is
关
not
上，
fully shut,
也不应
nor
被
should
关
it
上。
be.
中方多次
China
指
has
出，
pointed out on
乌
many
克兰问
occasions
题有
that
其复
there
杂
is
历
a
史经
complex
纬，
historical context on
局
the
势
Ukraine
演
issue,
变至今
and that the
是
current
各种
situation
因素
is the
综
result
合
of the
作用的
interplay
结果
of。many factors.
中国关于维护国
China's
家主权
position
和
on
领土完
safeguarding
整
the
的立场，
sovereignty and territorial
是一贯的。
integrity of all states has
联
been
合国宪章
consistent.
的宗旨
The
和原
purposes
则
and principles
也
of the
应
UN
当得
Charter
到
should be
共
jointly
同的维
upheld.
护。我们希望
We hope
有
that
关
all
当事方
parties
保持
concerned
冷静
will
和
stay
理性，
cool-headed and rational
致力于根据
and
联合
commit
国宪章
themselves
原则
to enhance
加强
dialogue
对
and
话协商，
consultation
谈判解决有
to
关问
resolve
题，
relevant issues
妥善
properly
处理
through
各方的
negotiations
合理安全关切。
and address each other's legitimate
当前
security concerns
尤其要避免激
in
化
line
矛
with
盾
the。principles of the UN
中
Charter.
方将继续以自己的方
It is
式
especially
劝和促
important
谈，
at the moment to avoid future
欢迎并
tensions.
鼓励
China will
一
continue to
切致
promote
力于
peace
推
talks
动
in its
外
own
交解
ways
决
and
的
welcomes
努
and
力。
encourages all
谢谢你，
efforts aimed
主席
at
先
a
生。
diplomatic solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю
I thank
представителя
the
Китая за его
representative of
заявление.
China for his
Предоставляю
statement, and
слово
I now give the
представителю
floor to the
Бразилии.
representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Secretary General and the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for the information and remarks they have put before the Council tonight. Mr. President, the reports received about the movement of troops into certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine are cause for extreme concern. The threat or use of force against the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of a UN member state is unacceptable. In the present circumstances, the Security Council must act according to its main purpose as holder of the primary responsibility under the United Nations Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. In the exercise of this responsibility, its actions must be geared towards reduction in tensions, towards assisting parties in their negotiations. This is our primary role. The recourse to arms and confrontation cannot lead to lasting peace. In that regard, we call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from any action that may further increase tensions on the ground. The time is not for belligerent rhetoric, nor for military threats, but to engage truly in a diplomatic process. The means of negotiation have not been exhausted. Immediate de-escalation is of high order. It means, among others, complete and unconditional withdrawal of all military forces as an effective measure for the prevention and removal of threats to peace. Parties must abide by the terms of the Minsk agreements, above all by its call for a comprehensive ceasefire. The monitoring mission of the OSCE can assist if granted unrestrained access in order to verify, identify, and report accordingly any violation of the ceasefire. Furthermore, the parties must allow the rapid, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and persons in vulnerable situations, must be respected unconditionally. We redouble our calls for the parties to work constructively in all relevant instances, such as the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. Negotiations must be mindful of the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of its member states. Negotiations must also, on one hand, take into account the security concerns of all parts of the conflict, and, on the other hand, aim to create the adequate conditions for an inclusive political dialogue which must reflect the diversity of and include representation from all peoples of the region. Brazil does not underestimate the complexity of the current situation, but we insist on dialogue as key to achieve a lasting settlement to this conflict. Too much is at stake here, above all, the lives of many civilians. We owe them all our efforts to bring this crisis to a peaceful solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I
thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me begin by, first of all, thanking the Secretary General and USG, Rosemary DiCarlo, for their significant briefings. Mr. Secretary General, Ghana is grateful to you for your clear statements on the situation in Ukraine, in defense of the Charter, the rules-based international order, and our collective security mechanism. The developments that are taking place in Ukraine are indeed troubling. The situation has implications not only for Ukraine and its immediate neighbors, but also for all our countries. Security is indivisible, and the insecurity of one is the insecurity of all. As we indicated in our statement to the Council on Monday night, Ghana deeply regrets the decision of the Russian Federation to unilaterally recognize the non-government controlled regions of Ukraine and to send troops into those regions. We are also deeply concerned by the implications of those decisions, which suggest that the Russian Federation has turned its back on the Minsk agreements and the path of dialogue required to address any concerns it may have over the implementation of the agreements and related security concerns. We have, however, read in reports this morning the statement attributed to the President of the Russian Federation that his country was always open to diplomacy. We urge that that avowed commitment to diplomacy that the Russian Federation has alluded to should be backed by present actions that de-escalate the situation on the ground and permit an atmosphere for dialogue. We note with concern the risk that an escalation of the situation in Ukraine holds for global peace and security, and stress that those that choose the path of conflict rather than peace bear the consequences of their actions. We are concerned by reports of the commencement of hybrid warfare against Ukraine, especially attempts of cyber attacks against some of its critical infrastructure. To de-escalate the situation, we urge the Russian Federation to reconsider any intentions to move troops into the eastern regions of Ukraine in response to the purported request by the leaders of the separatist regions for an intervention. Peacekeeping by its nature requires the consent of the parties and the impartiality of the peacekeeping force. The presence of the Russian troops in eastern Ukraine at this time would not fulfill those requirements. If there is a real need, the Council should be seized of the matter. We urge for calm and call upon all parties to maintain the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. We are particularly concerned by the high intensity of violations of the ceasefire in recent days and its consequences on the civilian populations in the Donbas region. We remind all parties of the need to respect international law and international humanitarian law and urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas. We condemn any military activity that would deliberately target civilians and civilian infrastructure and remind all parties of the personal responsibility that exists in international law. Mr. President, it may be begging the question, but nonetheless worth repeating. Ghana unreservedly stands by the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders, the same borders with which she joined this organization. We aver that the current developments in the eastern regions of Ukraine would not lead to a strategic gain for any party and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. As called for by the preamble of the Charter, we remind all parties to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Finally, we take this opportunity to urge all member states to exercise restraints on the respective unsettled but accepted situations across the globe and to uphold the collective security mechanism established through the Charter of the United Nations. Any differences that exist in international relations must be adjusted by peaceful and legal means. I thank you very much for your kind attention, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General for his urgent plea for peace and Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. In this grave moment, Kenya continues to call for respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine in line with the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. Kenya is deeply concerned by the rapid escalation of the conflict risks following the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states by the Russian Federation and the continued military escalation. We are concerned that there is a serious risk that a conflict enveloping the whole of the Donbas region will occur, present trends holding. Such a development would instantly lead to significant loss of life, a humanitarian crisis, and the large-scale population movement of refugees and internally displaced people. Kenya urgently calls for calm by all parties and their commitment to protecting civilians and civilian objects from any actions contrary to international law and international humanitarian law. We continue to believe that there is still an opportunity for diplomacy to produce a solution to this dangerous crisis. The required diplomatic steps should seek, in the short term, for a de-escalation of the situation and the limiting of all military maneuvers to prevent sparking a wider conflict. For this to happen, there must also be a stated commitment to negotiations between NATO and the Russian Federation in the middle and long term. Such a commitment will need the vision to design a viable security architecture for Europe that protects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine and other states, while being sensitive to the concerns of all relevant parties. Mr. President, we want to believe that this chamber, in light of its storied past, retains the wisdom and wherewithal to prevent a catastrophic war. We have confidence that the United Nations Charter, embraced as a whole, protects Ukraine and all countries, not only those with modest military means, but also the world's nuclear powers. When we consider the recent past of wars undertaken by choice, and when the Charter and international law were breached, eventually the safety and security of all parties was tragically undermined. Mr. President, the membership of this chamber was fundamentally shaped by the states that emerged victorious from World War II. In doing so, the Charter bestowed on them a special responsibility that reflected the sacrifices they had made to defeat a unique evil to mankind. We believe that the leaders who designed today's multilateral system were profoundly humbled by the catastrophic war they had survived, so much so that they were inspired to erect the sovereign equality of states as a central pillar of our United Nations. As such, we urge all members to recall the ruin from war that has been experienced by most states sitting around this table. It is in this moment of peril that we can powerfully pivot to recommit to the Charter our predecessors bequeathed us. A large part of that recommitment would be aided by our listening to the Secretary General and utilizing his good offices to deliver according to their intended design. In the coming days, we hope that we will observe de-escalation in Donbas and that every effort will be made to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. We further hope that we will benefit from the visionary leadership that the world needs today in committing to negotiating a lasting European security architecture that lowers perceptions of threat and promotes cooperation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you,
Je remercie
sir.
le secrétaire général
I
pour
thank
son
the
adresse
Secretary
ainsi que
General for
le
his
secrétaire général
statement,
adjoint
as
Mme
well as
Di Carlo
Undersecretary
pour les
General
informations
Di
fournies.
Carlo for the information she
Monsieur le Président,
provided.
c'est la 4e fois
Sir,
en
this
3
is the
semaines
fourth time in
que ce
3
Conseil se
weeks that
réunit
this
pour
council is
débattre de la
meeting
situation en
to
Ukraine.
discuss the situation in Ukraine.
Nous nous réunissons cette nuit,
We are
48
meeting this
heures
evening,
après notre séance,
48
notre
hours
dernière séance,
after our
parce que
latest
l'intégrité
meeting on
territoriale
the subject,
et la
because the
souveraineté nationale de
territorial
l'Ukraine ont été violées.
integrity and the national
Nous nous réunissons ce soir
sovereignty of Ukraine
parce que
have
d'innombrables vies
been
humaines,
attacked.
des femmes et des enfants
We are
sont
meeting
pris
this
dans les
evening
taux de la
because
violence
men,
meurtrière
women,
et des
and
affrontements
children are
à l'est de
caught
l'Ukraine,
in
engendrant
murderous
un
violence
exode massif
in eastern
qui met en
Ukraine,
péril la dignité et la survie de ces
leading
populations.
to a massive exodus
Nous nous
which
réunissons ce
imperils
soir
their dignity and safety.
Parce qu'une fois de
meet
plus,
this
le
evening
spectre
because
d'une
once
guerre
again,
dont l'ampleur des
the
conséquences est
spectre of
redoutée
a war
plane sur
with
toute une région
with
et
redoubtable
parce que nous redoutons
consequences hangs over
une
an
invasion
entire
imminente de
region,
l'Ukraine.
and because we fear
Au moment
an
où nous
imminent
rejetons les
invasion
atteintes
of
aux
Ukraine,
principes fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations
we
Unies,
see an
il
attack
est
on the
important que notre élan
fundamental
nous conduise encore
principles
plus loin
of the
vers le
Charter of the
respect de
United Nations,
l'intégralité des
and
dispositions de la Charte des Nations Unies
we must
et
go
que l'attention de
further
la
and
communauté
ensure
internationale
that
soit
all of the
portée
provisions of
avec
the
le même
Charter are
engagement,
respected,
avec la
and
même ardeur
that
dans toutes les situations
the
et toutes les
international
régions du monde
community
où
focus
la
with the
sécurité
same
et la dignité des
commitment, with
peuples
the
est
same
menacée.
ardor
Monsieur le
on
Président,
the need
la décision
for
de la Russie
preserving
de
peace and
reconnaître la
security.
souveraineté des républiques autoproclamées
The
de Donetsk
decision of
et de
Russia
Lugansk
to
est lourde de
recognize
conséquences pour la
the
souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine.
independence of Donetsk
Elle met à
and
mal la
Luhansk
pertinence et la mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk et elle accrédite les
sidelines
craintes
the relevance and the
récurrentes d'une
importance
action
of
militaire
the Minsk
imminente
agreements,
contre l'Ukraine.
and it
Mon pays
heightens
demeure fermement
an
attaché
imminent
au respect de
military
la
attack on
souveraineté
Ukraine.
de
My country
l'intégrité territoriale de
remains
chaque État.
attached to the
Le strict
territorial
respect de
integrity
ces
and
principes
sovereignty of
cardinaux
every
consacrés
state.
par la Charte des Nations Unies
The
et l'acte
strict
constitutif de l'Union
respect
africaine
of
constitue le
these
ciment de notre
principles
contrat
for the
social
African
en
Union
tant que
is
membre
the
de la
basis
communauté
of our
internationale.
social contract as
Nous demeurons
members of the
convaincus
international community.
que l'intense
We are
activité diplomatique
persuaded
et les
that
différentes démarches
intense
politiques de ces
diplomatic
dernières semaines
activity
finiront
in
par faire
of
prévaloir
recent
la logique
weeks
du
will
dialogue
lead to the
face à
prevalence
celle
of a
de la
logic of
confrontation
dialogue
et
over that
contribueront
of
à éviter
confrontation
l'irréparable.
and will
Monsieur le
contribute
Président,
to avoiding the
il y a 8 ans, dans un
irreparable.
contexte analogue
8 years
à
ago,
celui qui
Mr.
nous réunit
President,
aujourd'hui,
in a context similar to that which
52
brings us
États
together
membres des Nations
today,
Unies se sont
2
abstenus
member states
lors de
of
l'adoption de la résolution 68/262 de l'Assemblée
the
générale,
General
alors
Assembly
que
abstained,
les mêmes principes
while
fondamentaux de la
the
Charte des
same
Nations Unies
fundamental principles of the
qui
Charter
nous
of the
réunissent
United
aujourd'hui,
Nations that
dont
bring
nous
us
déplorons,
together today
étaient violés.
were violated.
Ce refus de s'aligner au-delà des
This
pressions subies
refusal
par les
to
délégations à New York comme dans les
align
capitales à cette époque,
themselves
pas si lointaine, traduit une
not
certaine
very long
incompréhension
ago
et peut-être une lassitude
translates
d'une frange significative
a lack of
de la communauté
understanding,
internationale
perhaps,
vis-à-vis de la persistance des zones
of
d'influence
the
que l'on croyait
international
surannées
community, of
après
the
la décolonisation
persistence
et la chute du mur
of
de Berlin.
zones of influence which we thought had
Malheureusement,
been
cette terrible
overcome
réalité
after the end of
se révèle
colonization.
résiliente dans plusieurs parties du monde,
Unfortunately,
notamment en
this
Afrique,
terrible
en Asie, en
reality
Amérique et aujourd'hui en Europe.
remains in several regions
Monsieur le
of the world,
Président,
in Asia and Africa,
ce Conseil a
and
besoin
today
de
in
garantir
Europe,
le
once
respect
again.
des principes
This
fondamentaux de la
Council
Charte
must guarantee
des Nations
the
Unies, en particulier le
fundamental
règlement pacifique des différends,
principles of
le
the
respect de
Charter.
l'intégrité territoriale des
It
États
must
et la
ensure
souveraineté
the
nationale.
respect of
Mon pays
national
appelle à un
sovereignty and
cessez-le-feu
territorial
immédiat
integrity. We call for an
et
immediate
à la désescalade,
ceasefire
ainsi qu'au
and
sens de la responsabilité,
de-escalation,
en
as well as a
privilégiant
sense of
les issues
responsibility
pacifiques de règlement des différends,
by giving
conformément à la
giving
Charte des Nations
priority
Unies,
to the
et demande
peaceful
aux
settlement
parties
of conflicts
à
in
protéger les
accordance with
civils
the
et les
Charter,
infrastructures
and we
civiles
call for
et à
protection of
s'abstenir de toute
civilians
action
and
pouvant
civilian
entraver le
infrastructure
déploiement de
and
l'aide
refraining
humanitaire
from
pour
any
les populations
action
qui en ont
that
besoin.
could create an obstacle for
Pour
the provision
terminer,
of humanitarian
je
assistance
voudrais
to the
réaffirmer
populations who
la
so sorely
conviction
need
de
it.
mon pays
I wish to conclude
pour
by
un ordre
reiterating
international fondé sur les
my
règles
country's
et non sur la loi du plus fort.
attachment
Et nous exhortons
to
l'ensemble des
a
partis à ne
rules-based
pas rompre le fil du
international
dialogue et à saisir
order,
toutes les
one which
opportunités
is based on the
susceptibles
rule
de
of
ramener
law,
la paix
not
en Ukraine.
on
Je vous remercie,
the
Monsieur le Président.
law that the strongest will prevail. Thank you very much, sir.
Я благодарю
I thank the
представителя
representative
Габона
of
за его
Gabon for
выступление.
his
Сейчас
statement, and I
предоставляю
now
слово
give the
представителю
floor
Мексики.
to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much,
Mi
Mr.
país
President.
agradece la presencia y el
My
llamado
country
del
is grateful
secretario
for the
general en esta
presence
sala,
and the call of
mismo
the
que
Secretary
respaldamos.
General
Agradecemos también la
in this
actualización que
chamber,
presentó la subsecretaria Di Carlo.
and we thank him for being
México
here.
lamenta
We
que a
also
pesar
thank
del
Ms.
llamado
Di Carlo for her
generalizado de
briefing.
la comunidad internacional,
Mexico deplores
las
the fact that
tensiones
despite
alrededor de Ucrania, en lugar de haber
widespread calls from the
disminuido, han
international
aumentado.
community,
Es por ello que
tensions
esta
around
noche nos
Ukraine,
vemos
instead of
obligados a
having
reunirnos
decreased, have
nuevamente aquí.
increased. For this
Todos los
reason, we
estados,
see
al haber
ourselves
ratificado la Carta de las
obliged to meet
Naciones
once
Unidas,
again in
nos
this chamber.
comprometimos a respetar
We
la
all, as
soberanía,
member
la
states,
independencia
having
política
ratified the
y la
Charter of the
integridad
United
territorial de los
Nations,
estados.
committed ourselves
Los
to
miembros del
respecting the
Consejo de
sovereignty,
Seguridad
political
tenemos
independence,
la
and territorial
responsabilidad
integrity of
primordial
states.
en el mantenimiento
We,
de la
members
paz
of the
y la
Security
seguridad
Council, have the
internacional.
first
Ello
responsibility
genera
for the
la
maintenance of
obligación de
peace and
garantizar
international
que el Consejo
security.
de Seguridad
This
pueda
creates the
desempeñar su
obligation
mandato
to
y
guarantee
de velar por el
that the
respeto de
Security
la Carta
Council
de
can
las Naciones
perform its
Unidas.
mandate and ensure the
México
respect for
respalda
the
todas las
Charter of the
declaraciones
United
del
Nations.
secretario general
Mexico
e
supports
insta a las partes a hacer
all of the
uso de los buenos
Secretary
oficios
General's
que el secretario
statements
general
and
ha
calls on
ofrecido.
parties to avail themselves
El
of the good
presidente de
offices
México
which the
declaró esta
Secretary
misma
General has
mañana
offered.
que no aceptamos
The
que un
President
país
of Mexico
invada a otro,
declared just this
ya que es
morning
contrario
that we will
al
not
derecho
accept
internacional.
the invasion of one country by
Recordamos una
another,
vez más
since it is
que
against
Rusia realizó
international
hace
law.
unos días
We
aquí
recall once
mismo
again
ante la comunidad
that
internacional
Russia, a few days
una
ago,
declaración
in this very
contundente
chamber,
de que no
before the
invadiría
international
Ucrania.
community,
El
made an
reciente anuncio
emphatic
de una
declaration
misión
that it would
especial
not
es
invade
contraria a
Ukraine.
esta declaración.
The sending of a
De
special
darse una
mission
de
runs
darse una
counter to
invasión,
this
ello
statement.
constituiría un acto
If
de
there were an
agresión de
invasion,
conformidad
this
con la
would be an
resolución
act of
3314
aggression in
de la
accordance with
Asamblea
Resolution
General.
3314
No claudicaremos en
of the
nuestro
General
llamado a
Assembly.
la distensión, a la
We will not
diplomacia
waver
y al
in our
diálogo.
call for
Una
detente,
solución diplomática es la única vía
diplomacy,
que evitará
and
caer
dialogue.
en el
A
precipicio
diplomatic
que
solution is the
implicaría
only
una guerra
way of
en
drawing
Europa.
away from the
Muchas gracias,
precipice,
señor
which
presidente.
would be a war in Europe. Thank you very much, sir.
Я благодарю
I thank the
представителя
representative of
Мексики
Mexico
за ее заявление.
for her
Сейчас я
statement, and I
сделаю
shall now make a
заявление
statement
в своем
in my
качестве
capacity as the
представителя
representative of
Российской
the
Федерации.
Russian Federation.
Уважаемые коллеги, сегодня у
Colleagues,
нас
today
выдался
we've had an
интенсивный день
intensive day
с точки
from the
зрения
point of view
обсуждения
of
украинского
discussions of
кризиса.
the Ukrainian
Я
crisis.
не буду
I
повторять
won't
сказанное
repeat what I
мною утром
said
в Генеральной
this morning
Ассамблее.
at the General Assembly.
Могу лишь с
I can
сожалением
only
констатировать по
state with
итогам
regret
дня,
that
что
taking
наши
stock
сигналы
of the
Киева о
day, our signals to Kiev about the
прекращения
need to stop
провокаций против
provocations
Луганской и
against
Донецкой
Lugansk
народных
and
республик
Donetsk People's
не были
Republics
услышаны.
were not heeded.
Похоже, что у
It would
наших
appear
украинских
that our
коллег, которые
Ukrainian
в
colleagues
последнее
who
время
recently
активно
have been
вооружают и
actively
подзуживают
armed
ряд
and
государств,
egged on by a host of
не
states
исчезало
are still
заблуждение о том, что
harboring
с
the
благословением
illusion
западных
that with the
кураторов
benediction of their
могут
Western
добиться
sponsors,
военного
they will be
решения
able to
проблемы
achieve a
Донбасса.
military solution to the problem in the
Иначе
Donbass.
сложно
Otherwise, it
объяснить
is difficult to
существенную
explain the substantial
интенсификацию обстрелов и
intensification of
диверсионных
shelling
актов
and acts of
на
diversion
территории
on the
республики.
territory of these republics.
СММ ОБСЕ
The Special
зафиксировал за
Monitoring Mission of the
истекшие
OSCE
сутки
recorded
почти
today almost
2000
2,000
случаев
cases
нарушения
of violations
режима
of the
прекращения
ceasefire
огня,
regime,
в том числе почти
including almost
1500 человек.
1,500 explosions.
Дончане и
Those living
луганчане
in Donetsk and
по-прежнему
Lugansk
вынуждены
still
укрываться в подвалах.
sheltering in basements.
Продолжается наплыв
The
беженцев в Россию.
Refugees are still
Одним
flowing into
словом,
Russia. In
характер
a word, the
провокации
nature of the
вооруженных сил Украины
provocation
не
by the
изменился.
Ukrainian military has not
Вы этого
changed.
замечать не хотите,
You don't want to
повторяя
notice
украинские
this,
басни о том,
repeating the
что
Ukrainian
дончане
fairy
чуть ли не
tales
сами
that
себя
those living
обстреливают.
in Donetsk are all but shelling
Удивляет,
themselves. It
что
is no
возрастающие
surprise that the
страдания
increasing
жителей
suffering
suffering of those living in the Donbass does not seem to affect our Western colleagues. Through the whole day of debate today at the General Assembly, you haven't been able to find one word of compassion or condolences. It is as if these 4 million people for you simply don't exist.
Я хотел бы напомнить о том, что принцип суверенитета и территориальной целостности государств, в нарушении которого применительно к Украине нас сегодня обвиняют, согласно декларации о принципах международного права, касающихся дружественных связей между народами, принятой в 1970 году, должен неукоснительно соблюдаться в отношении государств, я цитирую, соблюдающих в своих практических действиях принцип равноправия и самоопределения народов, и вследствие этого имеющих правительство, представляющее без различия расы, вероисповедания и цвета кожи весь народ, проживающий на данной территории. Конец цитаты. Сегодняшнее правительство Украины таковым, конечно, не является. Ведь трагедия Украины началась как раз после нелегитимного майданного переворота в 2014 году, когда вместо диалога с русскоязычными жителями Украины новая власть обрушила на них пушки и самолеты. Информации и свидетельств на этот счет предостаточно, однако наши западные партнеры предпочитали их не замечать. Мы постарались вчера и сегодня, позавчера и сегодня объяснить вам логику принятых руководством России решений о признании ЛНР и ДНР. Акцентировали необходимость обеспечения там мира и безопасности. Однако вы нас услышать не хотели и не хотите. Для вас, жителей Донбасса, исключительно разменные монеты в геополитической игре, направленные на ослабление России и продвижение блока НАТО к ее границам. Для нас же это женщины, дети и старики, 8 лет прячущиеся от украинских обстрелов. Для нас это и украинский народ, страдающий под гнетом майданной власти. В этом разница наших подходов. Не сменив геополитическую оптику, вы нас никогда не поймете. Но зато нам бесконечно благодарны те, ради кого принимались упомянутые решения, те, о ком вы не вспоминали все эти 8 лет, называя их исключительно пророссийскими сепаратистами и террористами. И для нас это самое главное. Хотел бы вновь повторить, что корень сегодняшнего кризиса вокруг Украины действует в самой Украине, занимавшейся многолетним саботажем своих прямых обязательств по Минскому комплексу мер. Еще на прошлой неделе существовала надежда на то, что в Киеве одумаются и все-таки выполнят то, под чем подписались в 2015 году. Для этого прежде всего был нужен прямой диалог с Донецком и Луганском. Однако очередное подтверждение неготовности Украины к такому диалогу, шагам по предоставлению Донбассу особого статуса, предусмотрено Минскими соглашениями, причем с поддержкой этой позиции западными покровителями, окончательно убедило нас в том, что мы просто не имеем права заставлять жителей Донбасса страдать и дальше. Поскольку, как я уже сказал, украинские провокации против Донбасса не только не прекратились, но и интенсифицировались, руководство ЛНР и ДНР обратилось к нам с просьбой оказать военную поддержку в соответствии с двусторонними договорами о сотрудничестве, заключенными одновременно с их признанием. Это логичный шаг, являющийся следствием действий украинского режима. В ходе этого заседания президент России Путин обратился с обращением, в котором он сообщил, что принял решение о специальной военной операции на Донбассе. Мы не знаем всех деталей сегодня, но кратко хочу вам сообщить, что из его тезиса следует, что оккупация Украины в наши планы не входит. Цель этой спецоперации — защиты людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины, а также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе граждан Российской Федерации. Это решение было принято в соответствии со статьей 51 Устава ООН, санкции Совета Федерации Российской Федерации и в исполнении соглашения о дружбе и взаимопонимании с ДНР и ЛНР. Сейчас поступает много информации на эту тему, ее пока еще предстоит проанализировать. Будем держать вас в курсе событий. Сейчас я возобновляю свои функции председателя Совета Безопасности и предоставляю слово представителю Украины.
Well, distinguished members of the Security Council, Secretary General, Under-Secretary, before I try to deliver parts of the statement that I came here with tonight, most of it is already useless since 10 p.m. New York time. I would like to cite Article 4 of the UN Charter. And it says, membership in the United Nations is open to all other peace-loving states which accept the obligations contained in the present Charter and in the judgment of the organization are able and willing to carry out these obligations. Russia is not able to carry out any of the obligations. The ambassador of the Russian Federation 3 minutes ago confirmed that his president declared a war on my country. So before I read parts of my statement, I would like to avail of the presence of the Secretary General and request the Secretary General to distribute among the members of the Security Council and the members of the General Assembly the legal memos by the Legal Council of the United Nations dated December 1991, and in particular the legal memo dated 19th of December 1991, the one that we've been trying to get out of the Secretariat for a very long time and we were denied to get it. The Article 4, paragraph 2 of the Charter reads, the admission of any such state to membership in the United Nations will be affected by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Mr. Secretary General, please instruct the Secretariat to distribute among the members of the Security Council and the members of the General Assembly a decision by the Security Council dated December 1991 that recommends that the Russian Federation can be a member of this organization, as well as a decision by the General Assembly dated December 1991, where General Assembly welcomes the Russian Federation to this organization. It would be a miracle if the Secretariat is able to produce such decisions. There is nothing in the Charter of the United Nations about continuity as a sneaky way to get into the organization. So when I was coming here an hour ago or so, I was intending to ask the Russian ambassador to confirm on the record that the Russian troops will not start firing at Ukrainians today and go ahead with the offensive. It became useless 48 minutes ago. Because about 48 minutes ago, your president declared the war on Ukraine. So now I would like to ask the ambassador of the Russian Federation to say on the record that at this very moment, your troops do not shell and bomb Ukrainian cities, that your troops do not move in the territory of Ukraine. You have a smartphone, you can call Lavrov right now. We can make a pause to let you go out and call him. If you are not in a position to give an affirmative answer, the Russian Federation ought to relinquish responsibilities of the President of the Security Council, pass these responsibilities on to a legitimate member of the Security Council, a member that is respectful of the Charter, and I ask the members of the Security Council to convene an emergency meeting immediately and consider all necessary draft decisions to stop the war. Because it's too late, my dear colleagues, to speak about de-escalation. Too late. The Russian president declared a war on the record. Should I play the video of your president? Ambassador, shall I do that right now, or you can confirm it? Do not interrupt me, please. Thank you.
Then don't ask me questions when you are speaking. Proceed with your statement.
Anyway, you declared the war. It is the responsibility of this body to stop the war. So I call on every one of you to do everything possible to stop the war. Or should I play the video with your president declaring the war? Thank you very much.
Опять я вынужден сказать фразу, что я благодарю представителя Украины за его выступление. На вопросы я отвечать не планирую. Все, что я знаю сегодня, я уже сказал. Будить министра Лаврова в это время не собираюсь. Вы сказали вам, что информация о том, как развиваются события, мы вам предоставим. И не называйте это войной, это называется специальная военная операция на Донбассе. Сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Германии.
Mr. President, we meet at the very moment of a military escalation we have not experienced in Europe for over a generation's time. The President of the Russian Federation announced a military operation on Ukrainian territory. We condemn this in the strongest possible terms. And we call upon all members of the Security Council and the United Nations to now stand up for Ukraine and against a shameless breach of international law. 2 days ago, Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk was harshly rejected in this Council. It had already dealt a devastating blow to the principles and the international order that the United Nations stand for. Russia has not listened, and it turns out it was not prepared to listen. It has continued its massive military buildup, and we observed and observe cyber attacks directed against Ukraine, and now Russian military is moving into Ukrainian territory. By the actions and this unprovoked military operation, Russia is violating the core principles of the UN Charter. We condemn the use of force against innocent people and the violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. We urge Russia to terminate its military action against Ukraine immediately and withdraw its troops. Mr. President, our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people. We will be steadfast in our support for Ukraine and our support for the UN Charter. The Russian aggression will come at an unprecedented price politically, economically, and morally. Mr. President, France, Ukraine, and my country stood ready for diplomacy, for another meeting in the Normandy format, or for the summit that Ukraine had proposed. With our allies and partners, we called on Russia to seek a diplomatic way forward in vain. Now is the moment to speak up and defend the international order of the UN Charter against unilateral aggression, jointly and decisively. Tonight we stand with Ukraine, and we are doing so unwavering and determined. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Germany for her statement. And now I give the floor to the United States, who wish to make a further statement.
Thank you. In my remarks tonight, I said that we predicted Russia's false flag attacks, the misinformation, the theatrical emergency meetings, and the cyber attacks. But one piece had not come to pass. Unfortunately, while we've been meeting in the Security Council tonight, it appears that President Putin has ordered that last step. At the exact time as we are gathered in the Council seeking peace, Putin delivered a message of war in total disdain for the responsibility of this council. This is a grave emergency. The council will need to act, and we will put a resolution on the table tomorrow. As President Biden said tonight, Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and our allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for a statement, and now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom, who asked to make a further statement.
Thank you. As we sat in this chamber urging Russia to step back, President Putin announced special military operations on Ukrainian territory. This is unprovoked and unjustified. This is a grave day for Ukraine and for the principles of the United Nations. We and our partners have been clear that there will be consequences for Russia's actions. We fully support the United States' call for a UN Security Council resolution. This council must do all it can to stop the war and uphold the Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and now I'll give the floor to the representative of Albania, who also wished to make a further statement.
Dear colleagues, we could not end this meeting that what we had feared and anticipated since days is happening. Explosions are reported in Kiev and in several other cities in Ukraine. Masks are finally down and tanks are in. As we speak, Russia is implementing its plan and attacking a neighbor to whom it has decided to deny existence, freedom, the land, dignity, and life. We call on all the members of the United Nations to rally in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, to stand with Ukraine and its people, to condemn firmly and unequivocally this aggression, to stand for peace, for rules, for international law, and take whatever measures they deem necessary to show the aggressor that its actions will bear consequences. Let me reiterate, Russia will be held responsible for the consequences of an unprovoked war, for the loss of human lives, for causing unbearable human pain, and for opting for destruction when we need development, for bringing death where we aspire for need and for hope, for choosing to become an outlaw when we need cooperation. Russia will bear historical blame and shame and the consequences of invading a neighboring country and attempting to destroy European security. Let's unite and make sure it will not succeed. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania, and I now give the floor to the representative of France for a further statement.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
au moment où nous nous réunissions en urgence pour essayer de prévenir le pire et le déclenchement d'une guerre, nous avons appris, comme vous tous, que le président de la Fédération de Russie avait ordonné une opération militaire spéciale dans le Donbass et que la Russie s'efforcera de démilitariser l'Ukraine. La Russie a donc fait le choix de la guerre. La France condamne dans les termes les plus forts le déclenchement de ces opérations. Cette décision annoncée au moment même où ce Conseil se réunit illustre le mépris dans lequel la Russie tient le droit international et les Nations Unies. La Russie doit en être comptable devant le Conseil de sécurité. C'est pourquoi la France se joindra à ses partenaires au sein de ce Conseil pour préparer dans les prochaines heures une résolution condamnant la guerre conduite par la Russie. Nous appelons l'ensemble des membres de ce Conseil à nous soutenir dans ces circonstances tragiques Under these tragic circumstances, we call on the Russian Federation to respect international humanitarian law, no matter what the circumstances. We call for the protection and respect of all civilians, including particularly vulnerable persons, women, children, and humanitarian personnel. Thank you, sir.
I thank
the representative of France, and I give the floor now to the representative of Ireland to make a further statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. When I spoke earlier, I said that the path for diplomacy and the path for dialogue was perilously narrow, and I didn't realise, in fact, how narrow and indeed how close to the precipice we really were just over an hour ago. We now see that that path has been closed by the announcement of military aggression on the part of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. That is something that we roundly condemn. We stand with the people of Ukraine tonight, with every man, woman and child who is seeing this news as we did, as we sat here in the chamber, and whose lives are at risk. We believe it is now time indeed for this Council to stand up and assume its responsibility and to speak out in the strongest possible terms about this act of aggression. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine to make a further statement.
Well, as I said, relinquish your duties as a chair. Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this Council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
Я бы хотел сказать в заключение,
wanted to
что
say in conclusion that we
не производим агрессию против
aren't
украинского народа,
being
а
aggressive
против
against
той
the
хунты,
Ukrainian
которая
people,
захватила
but
власть в Киеве.
against the junta that is
Список
in power
ораторов
in
исчерпан.
Kiev. There are no
Заседание
more
закрывается.
speakers on the list. This meeting is adjourned.